Dear viewers, the following stories are inspired by true events. However, the characters' names have been changed to protect privacy. One fall afternoon in 2010, in a quiet house in suburban Pennsylvania, Sarah's family's life changed forever. Sarah's little girl, Lily, had just turned 6 and loved to collect dolls. One day, when Sarah and Lily went to a local thrift store, Lily was immediately drawn to an old porcelain doll on the shelf. The doll had a chubby face, blue eyes, and curly blonde hair. It wore a white lace dress that had turned slightly yellow, and in its hand was a faded silk rose. Lily begged her mother to buy it for her, and Sarah, seeing her daughter's delight, agreed to buy it for a very low price. When she got home, Lily hugged the doll tightly to her chest and named it Daisy. The doll quickly became Lily's best friend, always by her side in all her activities. Sarah and her husband, Mark, were delighted that their daughter had a new playmate. Little did they know, the Daisy doll would bring horror to their family. A few weeks later, Sarah began to notice strange things around the Daisy doll. Sometimes, when she entered Lily's room, she would find the doll sitting in a different position than when she left it. At first, Sarah thought that Lily had moved it, but Lily often insisted that she had not touched the doll. One evening, while Sarah was putting Lily to sleep, she saw that the doll's eyes seemed to be looking at Lily. Even though its head was not moving, Sarah felt a little uneasy, but she tried to push the strange thought away. It must be my imagination, she told herself. The following days, the strange phenomena became more frequent. Sarah began to hear strange noises coming from Lily's room at night. Small rattling sounds like someone was moving furniture. When Sarah ran in to check, she found nothing unusual. Lily was still sleeping soundly, and the Daisy doll was still lying on the bed. Once, Sarah even heard a very small whisper coming from Lily's room as she passed by. She stopped, listened, but the whisper had disappeared. Sarah felt a vague fear begin to creep into her mind. Sarah told Mark about the strange things she had witnessed, but Mark did not believe her at first. He thought Sarah was too worried about her daughter. So she had hallucinations. You must be tired, Sarah. Don't think too much, Mark said. However, Mark also began to notice the Daisy doll. He found its eyes strange, as if it were staring at someone else. One evening, while Mark was watching TV in the living room, he caught a glimpse of the doll sitting on the sofa opposite. Even though Lily had long gone to bed, Mark felt a little uneasy, but he still tried to ignore it. The strange phenomena became more and more frightening. One evening, while Sarah was cleaning the kitchen, she heard the sound of toys falling from the shelf in Lily's room. She rushed into the room and saw the Daisy doll lying on the floor, surrounded by scattered toys. Lily insisted that she did not drop the doll. Sarah began to feel really worried. She could not explain these things. Maybe this doll was not normal. To monitor what happened at night, Mark decided to install a small surveillance camera in Lily's room. They placed the camera in a hidden corner, pointing straight at Lily's bed and the Daisy doll. The first night after installing the camera, Sarah and Mark nervously watched the recorded video. Everything was normal until about 3 a.m. In the darkness, they clearly saw the Daisy doll slowly moving away from Lily's bed. It slid down to the floor and began to stagger around the room. Sarah and Mark watched in horror as the scene on the screen unfolded. They couldn't believe their eyes. The doll was actually moving on its own. The video continued to show the Daisy doll stopping in front of Lily's bed, standing silently watching her sleep. Its blue eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. Sarah and Mark felt a cold fear spread throughout their bodies. Then, the doll slowly turned around and staggered towards the door of the room, then disappeared from the frame. Sarah and Mark had no more doubts. The Daisy doll was indeed haunted. The next morning, Sarah and Mark didn't say a word, hurriedly packing their things. They woke Lily up, explaining that they needed to go somewhere else. Lily seemed a little sad to be leaving her home, but she didn't object. They quickly loaded their belongings into the car, leaving the Daisy doll silently in the house. Both Sarah and Mark felt a deep fear and obsession. They knew that they could not stay in that house for another second. In the end, they decided to sell the house and move to a new place, hoping to escape the haunted doll and the horrors it had brought. On the first night at the motel, Sarah's whole family felt uneasy and tired. The room was cramped and strange, unable to give them a sense of security. Lily fell asleep on the double bed between her parents, but Sarah and Mark still tossed and turned. No one said a word to each other, but in their hearts they were all thinking about the Daisy doll. Left in that house, Sarah sighed softly, trying to dispel the image of the doll's blue eyes staring at Lily on the camera screen. Mark hugged Sarah tightly. He knew his wife was very scared. He himself, what they had witnessed last night, was completely beyond his understanding. The next morning, the three woke up with exhausted faces. Lily asked her mother when they would be going home, her voice sad. Sarah hugged her, gently saying, "We need to stay here for a few more days. Honey, I want to make sure everything is safe." Mark called a friend, a real estate broker, to ask him to help them sell the house as soon as possible. He didn't want to go back there even for a minute. The thought of the haunted doll still haunted him. Meanwhile, Sarah tried to keep Lily from thinking too much about the doll. She took her to a nearby park, bought her new toys to forget Daisy. But deep down, Sarah knew that they could never forget what had happened. The next few days at the motel passed in tension and anxiety. Sarah and Mark took turns staying up all night, afraid that the doll might somehow find them. They kept checking the doors and windows, even though they knew it was useless. One evening, while Sarah was bathing Lily, she heard a gentle knock on the door. Startled, she quickly wrapped her daughter in a towel and opened the door. But there was no one in the hallway. Sarah looked around, feeling a cold breeze on her face. "Who is it?" she called softly. But only the sound of the wind blowing through the crack in the door answered her. Mark also began to experience strange things. One night, while he was sleeping, he felt someone touching his leg. He woke up, but there was no one in the room. He turned on the light, checked everywhere but found nothing unusual. He tried to tell himself that it was just a stress-induced hallucination. But the feeling that someone was watching him did not go away. He began to feel uneasy. Even in the motel room, Lily also showed unusual behavior. She often talked to herself, and when asked, she said she was talking to Daisy. Sarah and Mark were extremely worried. They had left the doll at home, so why did Lily still mention it? One day, Lily drew a picture, and when she showed it to her mother, Sarah was startled to see a drawing of a Daisy doll with scary blue eyes. Next to the doll, Lily also drew a small figure crying. "Who is this?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "This is Daisy and Daisy's friend," Lily answered innocently. "Daisy's friend is very sad." "Mom." Sarah and Mark looked at each other with worried eyes. They did not want their daughter to be haunted by that evil doll. They decided to find out more about its origin. Mark searched online for information about the thrift store where they had bought the doll. He found the address, and decided to go there the next day to ask. Sarah felt uneasy. She didn't want anyone in her family to have to deal with that doll again. But she also knew that they needed to find out what was going on. The next day, Mark drove to the thrift store. The store looked old and messy, with all kinds of old things scattered about. Mark met the owner, a haggard-looking old woman. Mark told her about the Daisy doll and the strange phenomena his family had experienced. The old woman listened attentively, her face gradually becoming serious. "That doll," the old woman spoke slowly, her voice trembling slightly. "I remember it. It was brought here by a woman not long ago. She said she wanted to get rid of it because it brought bad luck." Mark asked the old woman about the woman, but she didn't remember much. She only remembered that the woman looked very sad and seemed to be in despair. When Mark asked about the origin of the doll, the old woman shook her head. "I don't know. It's very old. Maybe it's been through many hands." Mark felt disappointed. He couldn't find any useful information about the doll. But the words of the old woman who owned the shop made him even more worried. It seemed that the Daisy doll really carried something evil. His family had not yet escaped its haunting. That night, Sarah and Mark tried to create a normal atmosphere for Lily in the cramped motel room. They watched a cartoon on TV together, trying to laugh and joke to dispel the worries in their hearts. Lily seemed a little happier, but her eyes still occasionally glanced towards the door, as if waiting for someone. After Lily fell asleep, Sarah and Mark sat quietly side by side on the rickety double bed. Mark told Sarah about his conversation with the thrift store owner. Sarah listened, her heart growing heavier. So she, too, felt something was wrong with that doll. Sarah said softly, her voice full of worry. "We did the right thing by leaving it behind, didn't we?" Mark hugged Sarah, trying to reassure her. "I hope so. But I still feel uneasy. It's like it's still here somewhere." That night, Sarah was awakened by another strange noise. It sounded like someone was scratching lightly at the motel door. Sarah sat up, startled, listening. The scratching continued, quiet but steady and creepy. Sarah shook Mark gently. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark rubbed his eyes, listening for a moment. "There's something at the door," he said, his voice a little strained. They both held their breaths and listened. The scratching continued, as if a small animal was trying to claw its way into the room. Mark carefully got out of bed and walked softly toward the door. He looked through the keyhole but saw no one. He slowly opened the door, looking out into the dark hallway. No one was there. Mark frowned, feeling confused. He closed the door and went back to bed. No one. It must be the wind. But Sarah didn't believe it. She felt something was wrong. The scratching sounded strange, not like the wind or an animal. The next morning, while Sarah was preparing breakfast, Lily suddenly pointed to a corner of the room and said, "Mommy, it's Daisy." Sarah and Mark looked in the direction of Lily's hand, startled. In the corner of the room, on the old motel armchair, the Daisy doll sat there, her blue eyes staring straight at them. Sarah screamed in horror. Stepping back, Mark's face turned pale, unable to believe his eyes. How could that doll get here? They had left it in that house. Lily ran to hug the doll, her face beaming. "Daisy, I miss you so much." Sarah hurriedly pulled Lily away from the doll. "Lily, you can't touch it. It's not safe." Lily looked at her mother in confusion, not understanding what was happening. "But Mom, this is Daisy. She's a good girl." Mark cautiously approached the doll. He didn't dare touch it. He observed the doll closely, feeling a strange coldness radiating from it. "We have to throw it away," Mark said, his voice resolute. "We can't leave it here anymore." Sarah nodded in agreement. She also felt that this doll was bringing bad things to their family. Mark took an old towel, carefully wrapped the doll and took it to the trash can outside the motel. Both Sarah and Lily stood watching him with worried looks. "It's done," Mark said as he returned to the room. "We won't have to see it again." But that night, the horror continued to happen. Around 2 a.m., Sarah and Mark were awakened by Lily's terrified screams. They rushed to their daughter's bed and found Lily sitting up, pointing to the corner of the room with a panicked look on her face. Daisy is there," Lily sobbed. Sarah and Mark followed Lily's hand. In the darkness, they clearly saw the Daisy doll, sitting on the armchair, its blue eyes glowing in the darkness, staring at Lily with hatred. This time, neither Sarah nor Mark had any doubts. The Daisy doll was truly haunted. Not only was it haunted, but it had some kind of evil power. Following their family, they tried to run away, but they couldn't seem to escape its haunting. Extreme fear enveloped them, as they realized that the battle with this evil doll was just beginning. The next morning, the atmosphere in the motel room was more tense than ever. Sarah and Mark looked at each other with worried and fearful eyes. They couldn't understand how the Daisy doll could have returned here. After Mark had thrown it in the trash outside. "We have to destroy it," Mark said, his voice shaking but determined. "There's no other way. We can't live in fear anymore." Sarah nodded in agreement, tears still forming in the corners of her eyes. Lily sat silently on the bed, clutching her teddy bear, her eyes still filled with panic from last night. Mark took a hammer from the trunk, and Sarah found a large sack. They carefully placed Daisy in the sack, trying not to touch it directly. Once the doll was in the sack, they both felt a sudden rush of cold air, making them shiver. "I think we should burn it," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "That's probably the safest way." Mark nodded. "I think so too. We'll drive to a deserted area in the suburbs and burn it." They quickly packed up, loaded Lily into the car, and drove away. On the way, no one said a word to each other. Both Sarah and Mark felt an invisible pressure on their shoulders. They were afraid that the haunted doll might cause even worse things. When they reached a deserted vacant lot, Mark stopped the car. He took the sack containing the doll out of the trunk and carefully placed it on the ground. Sarah hugged Lily tightly, not daring to look. Mark used a hammer to hit the sack hard. The loud sound of the hammer echoed in the quiet space. After a few blows, the sack was torn apart, and the Daisy doll lay alone on the ground, its porcelain face broken into many pieces. Sarah and Mark breathed a sigh of relief. They thought that this nightmare was finally over. But at that moment, they heard a very small chuckle coming from the broken pieces of the doll. The laugh sounded cold and sinister, making both Sarah and Mark feel their hair stand on end. They looked at the broken pieces of the doll in horror. Its blue eyes, though shattered, seemed to still be staring at them with a mocking look. Mark quickly poured gasoline on the pieces and lit them on fire. The fire flared up fiercely, quickly burning the doll. Sarah hugged Lily tightly, trying to cover her eyes so she wouldn't have to see this terrifying scene. When the fire died down, only a pile of black ash remained. Sarah and Mark breathed a sigh of relief again. They believed that this time the doll was truly destroyed. They returned to the motel, hoping for a peaceful night. But as soon as they entered the room, they felt an unusual cold air. Sarah looked around, feeling that something was wrong. Suddenly, They heard the sound of things falling from the bathroom. Mark rushed in to check and saw that the large mirror on the wall had been shattered. Pieces of glass scattered all over the floor. Sarah and Mark looked at each other in horror. They couldn't believe what was happening. The doll had been burned to ashes. So why did strange things continue to happen? That night, Sarah, Mark and Lily couldn't sleep. They kept hearing strange noises in the room. Creepy whispers and footsteps. The climax was around 3 a.m. The night light on Lily's bedside table suddenly fell to the ground and broke. Lily cried out in fear. Sarah hugged her daughter tightly. Trying to comfort her, Mark felt helpless and desperate. They tried their best to get rid of the haunted doll, but it seemed to always find a way to haunt them. The next morning, Sarah and Mark decided they couldn't stay in this motel any longer. They quickly packed up and checked out. They didn't know where to go, but they knew they needed to get away from this place as far as possible. As they drove away, Sarah looked into the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of a figure sitting in the back seat. The figure was very small, and when she looked closer, she realized it was the figure of the Daisy doll. Its blue eyes were staring at her with a sinister smile. Sarah screamed in horror, swerving the car, almost driving off the road. The haunted doll was still following them, and the horror seemed to never end. Sarah's terrified scream startled Mark, who swerved the car, almost hitting the median. "What's wrong, Sarah?" he asked, his voice full of worry. Sarah pointed to the rearview mirror, her face pale. "The doll. It's behind." Mark looked into the mirror, but he saw nothing. "What did you say? There's no one there." "No, I saw it. It was in the back seat, looking at me," Sarah insisted, her voice still shaking. Mark pulled the car to the side of the road, turning around to look at the back seat. Still no one. Lily was fast asleep in the car seat, the teddy bear lying next to her. "Sarah, maybe you're just too nervous. I didn't see anything," Mark said, trying to reassure her, but Sarah insisted that she had seen the doll. She remembered the pale porcelain face and the blue eyes staring at her. "But I saw it, Mark. I'm not making it up," Sarah almost sobbed. Mark hugged his wife, knowing that Sarah wasn't a fantasist. Maybe all this horror had affected her psyche. Okay, Mark said softly. "I believe you, but maybe we should go to the hospital and get you checked out." Sarah shook her head. "I'm not hallucinating. I know I saw it. That doll, it's following us." The two of them sat in silence in the car for a while, the tension in the air settling over them. They both felt an invisible fear hovering around them. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice desperate. "We can't just run away forever." Mark thought for a moment, then said, "Maybe we should find out more about that doll. Maybe it has some history, some reason why it's haunting us." Sarah nodded in agreement. It was their only hope. They needed to find out where the Daisy doll came from, and why it was haunting their family. Mark drove to a nearby public library. They left Lily asleep in the car and went to the library together to search for information. Sarah and Mark searched the internet, and in books about haunted stories and cursed objects. They hoped to find some information related to the Daisy doll. After hours of searching, they were disappointed. There was no information about an old porcelain doll with blue eyes named Daisy. "Maybe it's not that famous," Mark said, his voice a little discouraged. But Sarah didn't give up. She remembered what the owner of the antique store had said about the woman who brought the doll there. "Maybe that woman knew something about it. We have to go back to that store," Sarah said. "Maybe she remembers something." Mark was hesitant at first. He didn't want to go back to the place that sold them the demonic doll. But he also knew that they had no other choice. They drove back to the thrift store. The old woman who owned the store was still sitting behind the counter. When she saw Sarah and Mark, she looked surprised. "Oh, it's you two. What's wrong?" the old woman asked. Sarah told her about the doll that had come back to haunt their family. The old woman's face turned pale as she listened. I'm afraid I forgot to tell you something," the old woman said, her voice trembling. "The woman who brought the doll here, she said that the doll had belonged to a little girl who had tragically died." Sarah and Mark looked at each other in horror. "What was the girl's name?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking. "I don't remember," the old woman said, "but I remember she cried a lot when she talked about her. She said that the doll was her last memento." A cold feeling spread through Sarah's body. She felt like she understood something. The Daisy doll was not only haunted, but it also carried the pain and loss of a young soul. And perhaps, it was looking for something in their family. After leaving the thrift store, Sarah and Mark decided to go to the local library. They hoped to find some information about the tragic deaths of children in this area. Perhaps some connection to the Daisy doll. They spent the afternoon rummaging through old newspapers and library archives. Sarah felt a pang of sadness as she read about the families who had suffered great loss. She wondered if the spirit of the little girl was trapped inside the doll. Mark found a short article in a local newspaper from the 1950s. The article was about a little girl named Annabelle, who died of a terminal illness when she was very young. Annabelle loved dolls, and she had a porcelain doll that she named Lily. Sarah and Mark looked at each other, feeling that it was an odd coincidence. Their daughter's name was Lily, and the doll in the article was named Lily. Could this be a coincidence? They continued to search, hoping to find more information about Annabelle and her family. Eventually, they found another article, telling how Annabelle's family had moved out of town. After her death, there was no word on what they had taken with them. Maybe Annabelle's doll was left somewhere, and ended up in the thrift store, Sarah said, her voice full of speculation. Mark agreed with Sarah. Maybe Annabelle's spirit is attached to that doll and is looking for something. They decided to go to the town's historical society, hoping to get more information about Annabelle's family. At the historical society, they met an elderly woman named Eleanor, who had lived in the town all her life. Sarah and Mark told her about the Daisy doll and what they had found in the library. Eleanor listened attentively to their story, then nodded slowly. "I miss Annabelle's family," she said. "They were good people. Annabelle's death is a great loss to the whole community." Eleanor tells Sarah and Mark about Annabelle, a sweet and loving little girl who always carried her porcelain doll with her. She also tells of Annabelle's parents' great grief after her death. They were so sad that they decided to move away, to try to forget the pain. Eleanor says, "I don't know what they took with them, but I remember Annabelle's porcelain doll was very special to her." Sarah asks Eleanor if she knows what happened to the doll after Annabelle's family moved away. Eleanor thinks for a moment and says, "I'm not sure, but I remember hearing that they left some things in the house before they left. Maybe the doll stayed there." Sarah and Mark feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe they have found the origin of the Daisy doll. "Do you know the address of the house where Annabelle's family used to live?" Mark asked. Eleanor nodded and wrote the address on a piece of paper for them. Sarah and Mark drove to the address Eleanor had given them. The house looked old and abandoned, with shuttered windows and a garden overgrown with weeds. A "sold" sign was posted on the front gate. They contacted the realtor who was selling the house, and asked permission to go inside. The realtor agreed and arranged to meet them there the next day. Sarah felt a little nervous, thinking about entering a house where Daisy the doll had probably lived for years. But she knew that they needed to do this to find out the truth and free Annabelle's spirit. The next day, Sarah and Mark, along with the realtor, went to Annabelle's old house. Inside, the house looked cold and empty. Dust covered the remaining old furniture. They walked through the rooms, observing everything around them. Sarah felt a sad presence hanging over the house. When they reached Annabelle's bedroom, Sarah felt a sudden cold air rush over her. She looked around the room and saw an old cupboard in the corner. Sarah approached the cupboard and carefully opened it. Inside, she saw a few old toys and a small wooden box. Sarah opened the box and was startled to see inside was an old porcelain doll with familiar blue eyes and curly blonde hair. It was the Daisy doll. But this time, Sarah noticed something different. The doll's face, no longer blank as before. Its blue eyes seemed to be looking at her with a deep sadness and a silent plea. Sarah felt a strange connection to the doll and to the spirit of the little girl Annabelle. She knew that they needed to help Annabelle find peace. Sarah gently lifted the doll from its old box. It seemed heavier than she had expected, and as it touched the cold porcelain, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The doll's blue eyes looked at her with a deep sadness, as if pleading for something. "This is it," Sarah whispered, her voice choked. "This is Annabelle's doll." Mark moved closer, eyeing the doll with suspicion. "So, the doll Lily found at the thrift store was this one. But why does it haunt Lily?" Sarah shook her head. She didn't know the answer, but she felt a strange connection between Lily and Annabelle. Some invisible string tying them together. They carried the doll down to the living room, placing it on the old, dusty table. Sarah and Mark both sat down across from it, silently observing. The atmosphere in the room became heavy and tense. "We need to find out what Annabelle wants," Sarah said after a moment of silence. "Maybe she wants us to help her with something." Mark nodded. "I agree. But how do we contact her?" Sarah remembered stories about people who could communicate with spirits. "Maybe we should find a psychic," she suggested. "They can help us talk to Annabelle." Mark was hesitant at first, but after thinking for a while, he agreed. They had no other choice. They searched the internet and found information about a famous psychic who lived in a nearby town. Sarah called him and arranged to meet him the next day. The next day, Sarah and Mark drove to the psychic's house. It was a small house hidden in a quiet garden. The psychic, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, welcomed them warmly. Sarah told him about what had happened to her family and the Daisy doll. The psychic listened attentively to her story. Then he looked at the doll Sarah had brought with her. "This doll carries a tormented soul," the psychic said, his voice dropping. "It's the spirit of a little girl who died very young. She loved this doll very much. We've learned that this doll used to belong to a little girl named Annabelle." Sarah said, "We think her spirit is haunting our daughter." The psychic nodded. "Yes, Annabelle's spirit is feeling lonely and lost. She can sense the presence of your daughter, Lily, and is trying to connect with her. So what can we do to help Annabelle?" Mark asked, his voice filled with concern. "Annabelle needs to be released," the psychic said. "She needs to know that she's dead and needs to leave." He suggested that Sarah and Mark take the doll back to Annabelle's old house. He would help them perform a ritual to release her spirit. Sarah and Mark agreed. They felt this was their last hope. They returned to the old house with the psychic. He prepared some necessary items for the ritual and instructed Sarah and Mark on what they needed to do. As the ritual began, the atmosphere in the house became colder than ever. The candles flickered violently, and strange noises were heard everywhere. Sarah felt an invisible presence very close to them. The psychic began to recite prayers. In a deep and solemn voice, Sarah and Mark held hands tightly, praying for Annabelle's soul to rest in peace. Suddenly, the Daisy doll on the table shook violently. Its blue eyes opened wide, staring at Sarah with an expression of utter anguish. A scream echoed in the room. Not Lily's cry, but a plaintive and desperate cry. Then, the doll slowly fell back onto the table. Lying still, the cold air in the room gradually dissipated, and the candles burned normally again. The psychic sighed, saying, "She has been released." Sarah and Mark looked at each other, feeling a strange sense of relief and peace. They hoped that this nightmare was finally over. A few days after the ceremony at Annabelle's old house, Sarah and Mark decided to return to their own house. They were still feeling a little nervous, but they hoped that everything was really over. Lily seemed happy to be back in her bedroom, but she was still a little shy, looking at the corner of the room where the Daisy doll used to be. Sarah hugged her daughter, gently saying, "It's okay. Honey, Daisy is gone. You don't need to be afraid anymore." Lily nodded, but her eyes were still a little worried. The first days after returning home, everything seemed peaceful. There were no more strange noises, no more shadowy figures, and Lily no longer mentioned Daisy. Sarah and Mark began to feel hopeful that this nightmare was really over. They began to clean and rearrange the house, trying to erase the traces of the past terrifying days. They repainted Lily's room, bought her new toys to replace the Daisy doll. Life gradually returned to normal. Lily played happily again, and Sarah and Mark began to feel more at ease. They thought they had finally escaped the haunting of the demon doll. One evening, while Sarah was putting Lily to sleep, she suddenly asked, "Mommy, are you sad that Daisy is leaving?" Sarah paused, feeling a little pain in her heart. She hugged her daughter tightly and said, "Maybe Daisy has found peace now. Honey, you don't need to worry about her anymore." But a few weeks later, the unusual signs began to appear again. Sarah heard strange noises again, coming from Lily's room at night. This time, the noise sounded like someone singing a very soft lullaby. Sarah rushed into Lily's room, but the little girl was still sleeping soundly. Sarah listened, and she realized it was an ancient lullaby, one she had never heard before. The singing sounded sad and plaintive, sending a chill down Sarah's spine. Sarah told Mark what she had heard, and he began to notice strange things too. Sometimes, they would see Lily's toys being shuffled unnaturally, or doors opening and closing without any wind. One evening, while Mark was watching TV in the living room, he caught a glimpse of a small shadow gliding across the hallway. He quickly got up to check, but saw no one. These phenomena were no longer as scary as before, but they still made Sarah and Mark feel uneasy. They began to doubt whether Annabelle's soul had truly been released. One night, Sarah woke up to find Lily sitting on the bed, staring into a dark corner of the room. "What are you looking at, Lily?" Sarah asked softly. Lily pointed to the dark corner and said, "Daisy is there. She's singing to you." Sarah turned on the light and looked into the corner of the room, but she saw nothing. She held Lily in her arms, trying to comfort her, but deep inside, Sarah felt a vague fear rising. They tried to free Annabelle's spirit, but perhaps some part of her still lingered in this house, attached to their daughter. Eventually, Sarah and Mark decided they could no longer live with this uncertainty. They decided to sell the house. and moved to a new place. One that they hoped would no longer be haunted by Annabelle's painful past and the Daisy doll. They never knew for sure if they were truly free of the haunting. But they hoped that in a new place, Lily would be able to grow up peacefully and happily, no longer haunted by the ghost of the blue-eyed porcelain doll. The story of the haunted doll in their house became a terrifying memory that they would never forget.